Panel today will discuss the market and technology changes for supply, application, and the production and exchange of energy that impacts and influences today's net zero energy buildings. Our panel today includes Jan Berman, Senior Director at Pacific Gas and Electric Company, Mark McCracken is a lead fellow and the CEO of CalMac Manufacturing Corporation, Gabriel Olson, Clean Energy Strategy Manager at Southern California Gas Company, and myself. I am Alexi Miller. I'm a Senior Project Manager here at New Buildings Institute. Before we begin, I've got a couple of housekeeping things to tell you about. First, you're muted and we cannot hear you. This helps keep the background noise down so that everyone can hear better. I want to direct you to the dashboard that you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen. If you're having technical difficulties and you cannot see the slides or hear our speakers, you can use the question pane in this dashboard to let us know, and we'll help you as we go. We'll take questions at the end of the webinar, but you can ask questions anytime during the session using that same question pane. At the end of the webinar, you'll be given the opportunity to take a short survey. I want to encourage you to fill out the survey, since this helps us prioritize the topics that are of highest interest. If you're seeking AIA credits, there's an opportunity to enter your member number in the post-webinar survey. Connie, let's head on to the next slide. I'd like to thank today's session sponsor, CalMac. Because of their sponsorship, we're able to provide this webinar for free to all of you. So thank you, CalMac. I would also like to thank our NBI sponsors. The generosity of these organizations allows us here at New Buildings Institute to provide vision and leadership in the field, and we couldn't do it without their support. So thank you once again to our sponsors. There are several more webinars coming up in our Getting to Zero series. Each webinar is held at the same time as this one, Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time, that's 1 p.m. Eastern time, and they all last 90 minutes. I encourage you to go take a look at newbuildings.org for more information on upcoming webinars. You can see the address down in the corner there. You can also visit there and see past webinars on demand. I'm pleased to announce that we will be hosting the 2016 Getting to Zero National Forum on October 12th to 14th, 2016, that's this year now, in Denver, Colorado. This is the premier national event for zero net energy buildings, and it's an excellent opportunity to deepen your knowledge on the topic and to connect with other people and organizations working to improve the built environment today and in the future. I hope to see you there. All right, let's get into the topic matter here. Today we're here to talk about building grid interactions. It's a changing world on both sides of the meter, and energy is no longer a one-directional transaction. Fuel options and applications, energy storage opportunities, and pricing and policy models all influence the way buildings can interact with the grid. I'll give you an introduction to these topics, and then we'll hear some more from some experts in the field. First, a quick definition. What do we mean when we refer to zero net energy or ZNE buildings? Well, a ZNE building produces as much energy on site as it consumes through clean renewable resources over the course of a year. These buildings often interact with the grid in new ways, and the growth in ZNE buildings is one factor precipitating new thinking about building grid interactions. We're seeing ZNE buildings over a wide variety of building types and sizes in locations all across the continent. We here at NBI track these buildings closely, and we currently know of nearly 250 buildings in North America that have either achieved ZNE status over the course of a year or have a stated ZNE goal. The growth in zero net energy buildings is a trend not to be ignored in the energy efficiency world. One of the drivers for large-scale adoption of ZNE buildings is the increasing affordability of on-site renewable resources, that is, solar panels. The price of PV panels has dropped substantially over the past decade, and it looks set to continue decreasing. This trend is enabling more and more buildings to reach for zero net energy, including some buildings that may not have considered that goal just a few years ago. This is the Bullitt Center in Seattle, Washington. It's a zero net energy building and a living building as well, actually. This building was designed from the ground up as a highly energy efficient building, including advanced controls, carefully designed daylighting, natural ventilation with passive heat recovery, and many more green features. Even this building, however, needed more solar power than the roof area would traditionally permit. The solar panel canopy on the roof that you can see overhangs the building and provides electricity, as well as shading for heat control. Buildings like these are moving from the cutting edge to the mainstream. This next slide gives an idea of the growth trajectory in solar installations in the United States. The trend is prices down, installations up. So where's the growth in PV happening? We've all heard about and we've seen PV panels installed on rooftops, both residential and non-residential. PV installations at the building scale are growing, certainly. But as you can see on this chart, a majority of the growth in solar PV installations in the US by watt is actually occurring at the utility scale, not necessarily on buildings. Large-scale solar installations are substantially cheaper per watt than distributed generation and lend themselves well to more intensive management by the utility. Both PVs at the utility scale and at the building scale are going to be part of the equation going forward. These trends have important implications for the grid as a whole and for the buildings of the future. Let's start with some discussion of utility scale trends. For electric and gas utilities, this is a time of tremendous change and uncertainty. Changing technology, like PVs and energy storage technology, new regulatory models, and engaged consumers are threatening to disrupt existing business models. This report, published by Utility Dive in 2015, gives a good snapshot of the state of the electric utility today. I'll just highlight a few key points. For one thing, next slide, please. For one thing, we see that distributed energy resources are the #1 growth opportunity in this sector. This includes many of the features found in zero net energy and in other high-performance buildings: on-site renewables, cogeneration, district energy, and so on. Long seen as a threat, distributed energy resources may well become the biggest driver of industry growth. While the survey notes frequent grumblings about what we call the death spiral of disengagement from the grid by consumers, utilities are viewing distributed energy as a massive opportunity. The ability to take advantage of this opportunity will require new regulatory frameworks, like, for example, reforming the Energy Vision, or REV. It's a proceeding in New York State that will create a marketplace for buying and selling distributed energy. This is a major piece of the puzzle when looking into the characteristics of and the challenges associated with zero net energy buildings and new building grid interactions. The #1 emerging technology, next slide please. The #1 emerging technology that utility companies are interested in investing in is energy storage. California's recent mandate requiring the state's big 3 investor-owned utilities, that's Pacific Gas and Electric, Southern California Edison, and Southern California Gas, San Diego Gas and Electric, to procure 1,325 megawatts of storage by 2020, essentially jump-started the utility-scale electricity storage market. Southern California Edison, for example, procured a little over 250 megawatts of storage through a competitive solicitation late in 2014. It was only required to procure 50 megawatts. So this interest in energy storage is followed closely by an interest in other technologies that center on the building grid interaction: energy efficiency and demand response, distributed solar, microgrids. These components are very important to a low energy future. And designing buildings that incorporate these strategies and technologies is very important to the future of the grid as a whole. So, changes in regulatory environments, new technologies, and enhanced customer expectations are combining to bring new business models into play. In thinking about what these business models may be, the focus of the utility sector and associated or related sectors, that's many of us on this webinar, is squarely on energy efficiency and demand response. what the utility future will look like is still to some extent to be determined. But it looks to me like we'll move beyond just selling kilowatt hours and therms and toward building, operating, and maintaining smart grid distribution platforms that incorporate building scale technologies. Next slide. You may think this is a big deal now, but it's going to get much bigger going forward in North America and across the world. In terms of codes and policy, we're seeing demand-side management and demand response come up more and more. For example, the 2015 International Green Conservation Code, or IGCC, and California's Title 24 Energy Code support greater demand response participation by simplifying and standardizing the auto-DR HVAC standard. And we can see, based on what you see here, as well as many other analyses, that this trend will only increase substantially with time. All right, let's bring this discussion down to the building level. After all, the end results of these new technologies coming into play will largely be felt at the building level, and what happens in each building matters to the grid as a whole. I like to think of there being two types of zero net energy buildings. Can you go to the next slide? Thanks. Renewable-oriented ZNE buildings and efficiency-oriented ZNE buildings. Renewable-oriented ZNE buildings typically have higher overall energy usage when compared to their efficiency-oriented peers. Of course, when they're compared to a run-of-the-mill building, they clearly stand out as energy efficient and high-performing. But to compensate for their somewhat higher, relatively higher energy usage, these buildings tend to have more renewable energy generation capacity, that is solar panels generally, installed on site. On the other hand, efficiency-oriented ZNE buildings are typically designed from the ground up to be as efficient as possible and tend to include only enough on-site renewable energy generation to cover the minimal needs of the building. These buildings are generally more energy efficient than their renewable-oriented peers. The integrated design process, common in these buildings, offers opportunities to make sure that grid-sensitive design elements are incorporated. We can get an idea of the difference between these two types of buildings by comparing active and passive strategies. Passive design strategies have been used for thousands of years, and they are, again, a critical part of high-performance building design today. Concepts like careful orientation of the building, placement of fenestration, glazing, to balance thermal effects with daylighting capability, passive HVAC design enabling the use of natural ventilation and free heating and cooling, and use of building elements like overhangs and exterior fins can all make a significant difference in a building's load profile. These passive strategies can offer built-in demand response because they're always on. Passive design strategies could be considered in midterm, that is day-ahead scale, load planning at the utility level. Utilities and ESCOs as well, energy service companies, can use predicted and actual demand effects of passive strategies to help control and shape building load profiles. We'll get a little bit more into that in Jan's presentation. Active design strategies have more recently still on the last one. Active design strategies have actually more recently become an important piece of the utility or the ESCO's demand response toolkit. Some of these strategies are well established. For example, curtailment of interruptible loads has been used for years to reduce peak loads, and contracts can be structured in various ways, optional curtailment or compulsory curtailment of loads, or combinations of both. Generally, today, these demand response resources in buildings involve HVAC, lighting, sometimes process loads, and tend to be on a short-term, that is minutes to hours basis. But new strategies are becoming more common in this space. For example, thermal storage tanks that allow a building to pre-cool a reservoir of water or ice overnight in preparation for a peak cooling day. We'll hear quite a bit more about that from Mark shortly. Night ventilation can also be considered an active strategy when it's used to reduce daytime HVAC energy requirements. Unlike a passive design strategy, these active strategies have to be initiated, either manually or automatically, before they provide benefits to the building or the grid. Now, these can go together in the same building, and each building, of course, has different options and priorities. For example, if we were doing an existing building renovation, we'd probably need to work around design limitations imposed by that particular building. It may well be that both passive and active strategies have a place in that building. And always, location and orientation can impact the best strategies for grid service potential. Okay, next. So the increasing adoption of the strategies I've been talking about, as well as other active and passive strategies, will be key pieces of the transition, going from simple widget-based energy efficiency efforts, incentivizing higher efficiency equipment and so on, to an intelligent building grid interface within an interactive distribution network. This transition relies on diverse drivers on both sides of the meter, which is shown here as the grid edge. Potentially wide swings in levels of energy production and consumption in zero net energy buildings are highlighting the importance of understanding the issues that these buildings will present to our continent's energy grids. With the realization that the two typologies, these two kinds of Z&E buildings, renewable-oriented and efficiency-oriented, both present distinct threats and opportunities to the grid, it's critical that our policies for Z&E design and construction account for the impacts on the grid, and that we develop those policies in a way that optimizes the Z&E building as a grid resource. A major transformation of the grid by distributed and local renewable energy is underway. The market forces behind the growth of renewables and other grid impacts, like electric vehicles, for instance, are significant, and they're moving rapidly. While power generation will be changing, the number of buildings that generate as much energy as they use will grow rapidly as well. How this next generation of buildings interacts with the grid will either be supportive of grid stabilization or will be an additional force exacerbating uneven grid delivery patterns. And how the policies for these zero net energy buildings roll out across the continent will be a critical factor in determining the monetary, the financial, and the environmental costs of supplying our future energy needs. All right. I will leave you with that, and I'm going to pass it over to Gabe Olson. Gabriel is a sustainability and environmental planning professional with 15 years of experience in energy, transportation, and infrastructure development. In his current role, Mr. Olson is the Clean Energy Strategy Manager with Southern California Gas, that's SoCalGas, managing a range of initiatives and projects at the intersection of energy efficiency programs, residential new construction, and cutting-edge gas technology. Past professional roles have included consulting on energy auditing, retrofitting and efficiency measure implementation, and greenhouse gas verification services. Mr. Olson has also delivered sustainability, energy efficiency, and renewable energy policy development plans for the nation's largest public transportation agency, and previously led the environmental permitting process for hundreds of megawatts of utility-scale solar in the southern United States. He was previously the co-founder of a nonprofit organization researching renewable energy finance and policy concepts. Take it away, Gabe.
Thank you. Yeah, this is Gabriel Olson, Clean Energy Strategy Manager with SoCalGas. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the role of natural gas in the Z&E future. Because it's not always discussed. Sometimes it's sort of a vision of all electric, and we actually believe that gas has a role to play. So there's actually a number of different definitions for Z&E, both on a national and a statewide level, and our goals are to make sure that regardless of which definition or measurement we are using, natural gas is included as a key element for a Z&E constructed building. So in California, the definition set by the CEC is actually the net of the amount of energy produced by on-site renewable energy resources is equal to the value of the energy consumed annually by the building. And that includes what's called time-dependent valuation, TDV, which is sort of a dense concept, but basically TDV is a factor of energy that is essentially how do you explain it? It's calculated by multiplying the site energy use, electricity in kilowatts, natural gas therms, or fuel oil, or propane, for each energy type times the applicable TDV multiplier. So every hour of every year has a different relative value for different types of energies. And that's a complex and hard to describe or hard to think of concept, but essentially it does include the value of natural gas in that equation. So California uses that definition. The Department of Energy, the Federal Department of Energy, states that a zero energy building, or effectively Z&E, is an energy efficient building where, on a source energy basis, the actual annual delivered energy is less than or equal to the on-site renewable exported energy. So they're using a source oriented definition, as in where does the energy originally come from. And that's important because most electricity that comes from the grid in California in particular is generated by natural gas. So that's important in that natural gas has a much lower TDV value and a lower source multiplier compared to electric values to account for the source and equipment inefficiencies as well as the cost effectiveness of natural gas. So using high efficiency gas appliances actually allow for builders to downsize PV systems on individual buildings and to lower the overall cost to build a Z&E building. So we're talking about efficiency both in terms of energy use and cost efficiency, and that's one of the key elements here for natural gas. Next slide, please. So California is actually leading the way in Z&E, in setting Z&E goals. By 2020, all residential new construction must be Z&E. By 2030, all commercial new construction and 50% of existing commercial buildings have to be retrofitted to meet Z&E. That's huge. The magnitude of this challenge is quite significant. In the 12-county SoCalGas service area in Southern California, it means that addressing energy consumption and generation for 86,000 new homes per year by 2020. That's the estimated construction rate by 2020, with a substantial increase in multifamily homes during that time. That's a lot of new buildings. That's homes and commercial buildings of all shapes and sizes at all price points. So you can think of the communities around where you live and work and think of all the new potential development that may occur in those areas over the next 5 years. And in some of these areas, there's homes where residents can't even afford to caulk their windows or paint their shutters, and small businesses or retail shops where eventually they could be expected to change out their appliances and add energy generation infrastructure. So there's some real costs involved there. Next slide, please. So we advocate for realistic approach to the future of Z&E. Given the significant scope of the structures impacted and the potential unintended consequences to consumers, we want to make sure that the progress towards Z&E is realistic and responsible. So we're advocating in general for policies and approaches that follow some basic guidelines. We advocate for policies that are fact-based, that look at the real life cycle efficiencies and emissions of different energy technologies. We're advocating for policies that are economically viable for builders and consumers to take into consideration the different socioeconomic levels within our communities. We're looking at things that should be timed properly for the actual availability of technology and for acceptance by the market, such that we can give information and provide enough time for builders and consumers to understand and learn about the concept of Z&E and the actual enabling technologies. And I think, importantly, we need to actually meet consumer needs and preferences. So we don't want to just take away the consumer's choice. We want to actually enable them to make different choices based on what they actually need to do for their business or for their home or their future construction project. Next slide. So in California, and probably elsewhere as well, codes and standards are driving energy efficiency and Z&E. Specifically, Title 24 and Title 20 are being used as the driver to meet Z&E goals. So this slide depicts an overview of the 2016 Title 24 measures that will be impacted during this cycle. SoCalGas will continue to be actively engaged to ensure codes are economically feasible. The California Energy Commission is aggressively promoting accelerated code adoption as a pathway to Z&E rather than natural adoption of technology in the marketplace, facilitated by emerging technology deployment and energy efficiency programs. So they're using this as sort of the wedge to move it forward. They're using codes and standards that way. Meanwhile, the IOUs are actively engaged in ensuring that all codes are cost-effective and beneficial for our customers to save energy and money. So the actual incremental cost of financing a fully constructed Z&E home is in the range of $20,000 to $50,000. So in order to get to Z&E, we have to continue to strive for energy efficiency and focus on codes to be both economically and technically feasible in order to open the minds of our consumers. Next slide. Really what we want to say is that meeting Z&E goals, natural gas is part of the solution. Next slide. There's a few key data points that kind of point to this. Natural gas is actually the preferred choice. We can't lose sight of our customers. As I was saying, they should always have a choice. When you look at the numbers, it's clear that natural gas is actually the preferred choice for cooking, for heating, and many other applications in the home. Next slide. Natural gas is quite affordable. So it has cost savings for both builders and home buyers. Navigant, who provided some of the data here, is a consulting firm. They conducted a study that assessed a mixed fuel Z&E home, mixed fuel as in gas and electric within the same building, compared to an electric-only Z&E home. The results stated that a mixed fuel home allows the builder to reduce the size of the PV system because natural gas is more efficient and cost effective. So, you know, one of the obvious reason why natural gas is the #1 choice for customers is that it's much more affordable. But regardless of the fuel choice, each Z&E home implemented a building envelope, HVAC, and water heating efficiency measures first before adding a moderately sized PV system. That's the loading order for construction and design of a Z&E home. So these Z&E technologies greatly reduced the annual utility costs for those homes and only required modest incremental payments when included within the home's mortgage payments. So, you know, I think another important thing to consider, and particularly in California, we have a 33% poverty rate. And this cost savings for natural gas, between $232 and $748 per year, according to the study, it may not sound like a significant amount of money for some of us, but it could mean a tremendous amount to the most vulnerable of our customers, and we should be cognizant of that fact when discussing the potential elimination of natural gas from the equation. Next slide, please. Another important point is that natural gas is actually more efficient on an end-use basis, or on a source-to-end-use basis. So many people do not realize how much efficiency is actually lost, or maintained for that matter, through the production and delivery cycle. So looking at this chart, if you start with 100 units of energy, and you look at the gas distribution or electricity distribution grid, you'll see that through the production to distribution process, natural gas is more efficient, meaning that you lose fewer units of energy from the starting point to the actual distribution and use by the customer. So I can go into discussion of that, but I think it's pretty clear what it's showing here. It's a factor of 10% loss for natural gas from the origin, the source to the customer, and you only retain 27% by the time that you deliver a unit of electricity. Now, you may be asking, in a Z&E future, won't all electricity come from solar? Oops, sorry, or other renewable sources, but we know that even with solar panels, a Z&E home will still rely on grid electricity some of the time. And at this point, the grid is still mostly powered by natural gas electricity generation. So when we consider our options, you have to consider how we can best use every source and not just waste it. You can go to the next slide. So I have a couple of demonstration projects that we're currently working on, Z&E demonstration projects. On the top left, this is a house in Lancaster in northern LA County. It's the Dawn Creek project in partnership with KB Homes. This is integrating some advanced technologies including a tankless water heater, hydronic space heating, drain heat recovery, and natural gas fueling. It's attractive to customers who want to be ahead of current energy requirements, have lower overall net energy costs, higher resale value, and who also value architectural, mechanical, and environmental leadership. On the top right, there's the ABC Green Home project. It's actually in partnership with the Habitat for Humanity organization, and this home is actually being constructed for disabled U.S. veterans and their families, and it includes a full complement of natural gas appliances that are designed to demonstrate best practices in affordable, high-performance housing. So these homes will be constructed to meet several certifications, including LEED, Cal Green, Build It Green, California Advanced Homes, Energy Star, and NAHB Green. So we're kind of pushing the envelope on that one. The bottom left is the resort at Playa Vista. It's a partnership with Brookfield Residential and LADWP. It's actually a community center within a larger new residential sort of development there on the west side of Los Angeles, and it incorporates a ultra clean CHP unit working in conjunction with a solar PV system. So it's kind of demonstrating how gas technologies can be integrated with a full building design system that also has solar and lots of other highly efficient windows and low flow showers and faucets. It's a really interesting building. It's projected to save about $10,000 a year through both the solar and CHP technologies. And then on the bottom left, there is it's a series of pilot projects using Prop 39 funding, and we're looking at how to retrofit existing schools to meet Z&E requirements. So that's sort of a proof of concept idea that will show feasibility across California for lots of other schools. And currently we're working on a project with Santiago High School in partnership with SoCal Edison, and Los Osos Middle School in partnership with PG&E. So those are exciting. Next slide, please. So really, the sky is the limit. We have many great technologies in the natural gas industry to lead us into the future of efficient and reliable energy. And the Z&E Home of the Future will incorporate a wide range of energy efficiency, production, storage, and management technologies. And in the next 5 years, we're seeing a variety of kind of near-term technologies that are going to become more and more common, including integrated tankless water heating with hot water circulating pumps, hydronic heating, which is a combined hot water and air handling systems, shower drain heat recovery, energy efficient smart gas appliances, home area networks, smart thermostats like Nest, I'm sure you've heard of them, CNG refueling for CNG cars. And then beyond 2020, we're also actively investigating possibilities and technology options for fuel cells and micro CHP systems, gas heat pump technologies, and how to integrate all of this with electric battery systems, which we're also seeing coming down the road. So these advanced technologies can actually provide TDV benefits for Z&E homes today, but yet they're not quite cost effective. So the projected cost and performance advances over the next decade will definitely improve the economic attractiveness of these technologies. They're just not quite there yet. Next slide, please. One more, there you go. So the future of natural gas, we do see a bunch of interesting things and kind of new directions. Renewable natural gas is something that gets away from the fossil fuel side and moves towards actual renewable energy. We do know, it's known as biogas in this context, and it has the potential to supply up to 20% of California's annual natural gas consumption, and effectively reduce the amount of methane that's released into the atmosphere. So California could actually produce almost 300 billion cubic feet of natural gas, renewable natural gas per year from just organic waste. Instead of landfilling or burning the waste, we could use it to generate enough renewable electricity to power 2 to 3 million homes, or to replace 75% of all diesel used by California vehicles. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but the reality is biogas is a solution that's about 10 years out. The challenge, as is the case with any emerging technology, is quite correctly economic. So we need our state policymakers and regulators to invest in and set up incentives to realize the potential of biogas conditioning services. Next slide, please. Another one is power to gas, which is directly addressing the storage challenge. So we have partnered with UC Irvine and the National Fuel Cell Research Center to convert electricity from renewable sources into hydrogen and methane, and essentially use our existing natural gas pipelines to store this surplus power. The power-to-gas technologies that are being developed now and be commercially available in about 5 to 10 years essentially take that peak excess electricity from solar and from wind at utility scale and convert it into renewable gas that's stored in our pipelines, providing a very low carbon gas supply that we can then use whenever we need it. So there's quite a bit of detail in the actual chemical process we don't have time for, but about 10% of our methane demand could actually be met from power to gas. On top of the potential sourcing from biogas that I was just talking about, we could actually replace a substantial amount of our current natural gas supply with renewable natural gas. Go to the next slide, please. So natural gas really does offer a practical path to meet GHG reduction goals, kind of on the big picture. And it's about reducing the use of biogas specifically can help us reduce emissions in sectors that are otherwise difficult to electrify, including heavy-duty vehicles, certain residential and commercial end uses such as cooking, existing space and water heating, and industrial end uses such as process heating. Integrating the use of that peak renewable electricity and converting it into gas through power to gas technology can play an important role in actually bringing that renewable generation into our pipeline and actually using it when it's actually needed instead of investing in very expensive battery systems at utility scale. Another important aspect is we need to leverage the existing pipelines that we have, our existing infrastructure. So continuing to use our gas pipeline distribution network, we can eliminate the need for new energy delivery infrastructure to meet 2050 GHG targets, such as hydrogen pipelines or additional electric transmission and distribution capacity. And finally, decarbonized gas technologies help to diversify the technology risk associated with heavy reliance on a limited number of energy sources, and would allow consumers, businesses, and policymakers greater flexibility and choice in the transition to a low-carbon energy system. And that's it for me, so thank you. We'll take questions at the end, I guess.
Thank you, Gabe. Yeah, there are a few questions, and we will take them at the end. So I've been recording them and combining, and we'll have some interesting discussion around that in a few more minutes. I would like to introduce Mark McCracken. Mark is the CEO of Calmac Manufacturing Corporation, today's session sponsor, incidentally, which is one of the largest manufacturers of thermal energy storage in the world, with over 4,000 installations in 36 countries. In his 39 years with the firm, he's been involved in all aspects of the company, including R&D, contracts, patents, manufacturing, marketing, and finance. He was the principal investigator on research projects with Oak Ridge National Labs, NASA, and the National Renewable Energy Lab. Mark?
Well, thanks, Alexi. So as you can see from the title, we're going to be talking about energy storage, and particularly thermal energy storage, and how it's going to be so important for a low-carbon future. Basically, the relationship between buildings and the grid has been you use electricity and you pay for that electricity. And I'm going to try to show how when you use power and how you use the power is going to be critical as we move towards zero energy buildings. So if we go to the next slide, this is most people know the form, next slide. There we go. Well, okay. So one form of cool energy storage is ice cubes for a party. And I would assume everybody on the call would think it's a bad idea to start making the ice cubes for your party when people start walking in the door. Kind of been in that situation once in our life. Well, it turns out you need about a pound of ice per person coming to your party, maybe 2, but it's somewhere in that range. But to air condition that same person the next day when they go to their office, and we'll just call it equivalent pounds of, we'll call it ice or cooling, to air condition them in an efficient building, you need somewhere between 150 to 300 pounds equivalent cooling to keep that person comfortable. So the question is, if it's ludicrous to wait for a party for £1, why isn't it hundreds of times more ludicrous to act like you didn't know people were coming and then start buying all this electricity during the hot part of the day in order to keep people comfortable? So if we go to the next slide, you can see the impact that this practice on how we use the power has had on the electric grid. This is a chart that shows load factors, and load factor is essentially the amount of energy that's created in a year divided by the peak load for the year. And in the United States in the late 50s and early 60s, we were closing in on a 70% load factor. So that means 24 hours a day, 365, we were using 70% on average of our capacity day and night. Now, ever since the advent of air conditioning, which has been added to buildings, that load factor has been dropping. And now we are below a 50% load factor. So the daytime, all usage has been going up, but the daytime peak usage has been going up much faster. So when you have a 50% load factor, that means that you actually have twice as much generation, distribution, and transmission as you need if you are using electricity at a level rate day and night. Now this peakiness makes us have to invest trillions of dollars of infrastructure for a very short period of time. So if we go to the next slide, this is called a duration curve, and a duration curve is for an electric grid. So this happens to be for New England. There's 9 electric grids around the United States actually, and it takes all 8760 hours of the year, and it takes the output for each hour. So if you go to the far right-hand side, you'll see that the lowest hour was 9,000 megawatts output for the New England grid. And if you go to the far left-hand side, you see that their peak was just above 28,000 megawatts for 1 hour of the year. And so you build from one side to the other, and you get what's called the duration curve. Now, the interesting part of the curve is that the average is somewhere around 50%, 53%. But the peak, the last 21% of the peak is needed for only 2% of the, less than 2% of the hours of the year. So we put in a tremendous amount of infrastructure to handle a very small portion of time. So if we go to the next slide, this demand, now if we look on a chronological basis, this is the hottest week of the year in 2006. I had the data for, and you can see how the output of the grid is going up and down, and on the Wednesday you can see it peaks at the 28,000, but just 12 hours earlier or later you're down close to where the average output for the year is. So the grid has to be able to ramp up and ramp down in a very short period of time, and it only has to be up there for a very short period of time for the entire year. Now, this demand drives prices up. So let's talk about price for a second of energy. Let's go to the next slide. If you saw a gas station and daytime the price was $1.99, and at night it was 75 cents, I'm quite sure everybody on the call would make an effort to go at night and save that kind of money. And it's almost laughable to kind of put this up and put it in front of people. But the reason I do is because unbeknownst to, I would say, most people, electric utilities offer this kind of deal all the time because of these huge changes in demand. So let's go to the next slide. If we look at Austin's energy rate, this is what they'll call a flat rate. Their energy charge, which is the same thing the way a residential is, you're charged for how many kilowatt hours you use. Okay, so it's the same day and night, so they'll call this a flat rate. And you kind of get the feeling that the cost of electricity is the same day and night. Now, residentially, that would be correct. But on a commercial rate, which this is, commercial buildings have demand charges. And so for the 4 summer months, the demand charge is $14 per kilowatt per month. So what does that mean? Well, they have like a speedometer on your electric meter, and if you go up to 80 miles an hour in your car once during the entire month, you know, this meter doesn't go back down. So it records what your highest demand was. And the utility's logic is, hey, we had to have this here ready for you, so they have to recoup some of that investment. Well, if you advance the slide, just the animation, when you factor in that $14 demand charge and only apply it to things that peak, that are used during the day when the building is peaking, it turns out that that kilowatt hour during the day is actually costing you about 14 cents, and the nighttime electricity is only about 5 cents. So that same ratio that you saw on the gas is what commercial buildings are seeing every single day, and yet most buildings don't take advantage of this big sale on electricity each night. Advance. So you got a 62% less costly at night. Next slide. So let's look at fuel for a second. Everybody knows the two top ones are fossil fuels, and they're forms of not just energy, they're forms of stored energy. And if we go to the second, go advance again, you're going to see that the solar and wind, those are pure energy. So the question is, advance again, where is the storage in this? And the answer is that, well, there really is no storage on the electric grid now, and that's where the problem is. So if we advance the slide, the electric grid right now, or this is what we'll call the past, we have different sources of input, hydro, nuclear, and then fossil fuels. And that goes into the grid, and then instantaneously that exact amount of energy has to be coming out, either going to residential or commercial. Advance the slide. Now, as we're moving towards a less carbon-intensive energy supply, we're adding wind and solar to the grid. We are putting some solar on the commercial buildings, lower left, and we're adding solar to houses. And so now the transport of energy is going back and forth at the loads in the commercial buildings and residential. You're having wind going on the grid whenever there is wind, and you're having solar go on the grid whenever there's solar, and yet there's still no storage. Advance to the next slide. So let's see what this is doing. Wind generation. This is a particular wind farm in California. It's got 1,000 megawatts of wind. This is about 9 days worth of cycling up and down. You can see like that third or fourth day, it's peaking up near the 1,000 megawatts. But the interesting thing is that the red diamonds are when the utility was peaking. So it's pretty clear that when the utilities need it the most, or when the buildings need it the most, they're getting the least from this renewable source. So if you advance the slide, the impact in Texas was quite dramatic. In Texas in 2009, 11% of the time, the wholesale price of electricity was 0 or less. So less than 0 electric rates means the utility was paying people to take the electricity off the grid because they have too much. It's very difficult to turn down nuclear plants, baseload other plants are very difficult to turn down, and so they're paying people to take power off the grid, and this is simply because there's no storage on the grid. Next slide. So you can see there's no place for that electricity to go, and so they're paying people to take it and monitoring that on the meters. Next slide. So the easiest way to show how important it is for zero energy buildings is, let's say you have a zero energy building, and let's say for a moment that it's off grid. Advance the slide. I can guarantee you that that zero energy building is going to have many different types of energy storage on it. It'll have batteries, it'll have thermal there for heat or for cool, And it'll have fossil fuels, which, as I said, is a type of energy, stored energy. Now, just because you take two wires, advance the slide, and you connect this building to the grid, those storage issues don't go away. Advance the slide. You've just exported those issues that you have to the grid or to society. And this is one of the defects so far in the evaluation of zero energy buildings, is that they're really not looking at the peak demand requirements of zero energy buildings, and they are simply net metering with the grid. And I like to kind of relate that to, let's say, if the utility was a car rental company of electric cars. Net metering is kind of like they gave you the car full of electric charge, and you use it for a year, and if you come back at the end of the year, as long as that battery's fully charged, you know, we're kind of even. And that totally negates all the value you got out of that car and all the you were able to do with that car. And I think net energy and is the balancing of the grid going back and forth. That's going to be changing because it's not going to work for the utilities long term. Next slide. And the reason is, if we go back to this load factor calculation or chart, so I showed before that we were up at 70% and we went to below 50. Well, a zero net energy building, its average usage for the year is 0, and you're dividing it by some peak because when the clouds come over, you're going to be drawing power and a lot of it. So the load factor on a ZNE building is 0. Well, you can see how difficult this is for the utilities to deal with. So if we advance the slide, what you are going to be seeing is all sorts of energy storage being added to buildings, to be added both residential and commercial, and onto the grid itself. Next slide. There are all types of energy storage out there. In the center, you'll see lithium ion. You'll have those in your pockets for your cell phone. We have lead acid batteries. We have flywheels. So the types of storage you have on the lower left-hand side of this are based about power quality. So that's kind of keeping the 60 cycles 60. And then if you do the band across the center from lower right to upper left, that's called bridging power. And these technologies are ones that help change the grid when it's using a low amount of power, moving up to using a lot of power to supply to the buildings. And then finally, you have the upper right-hand side, which is bulk power. You're storing a lot of energy to be used. And the one that most people are familiar with is pumped hydro, where you take water, you pump it up a mountain, and then during the day, you let the water come back down, and you reclaim that energy and put it back onto the grid. Now, thermal storage covers a large span from being able to discharge in minutes to hours, and from very small systems to very large systems. And what I would say is that because 40%, 35 to 40% of the peak electric draw on a hot summer day is that instantaneous creation of cooling, that thermal storage is the easiest and by far the largest load in a building that is movable. So in a zero building, being able to store some energy, especially cooling energy, if there is cooling associated with it, is the low-hanging fruit. And this was captured in the next slide on a quote in Al Gore's book, Our Choice, that it is dramatically, next slide, it's dramatically less expensive to store cooling than it is the electrons to make it. So, you know, we're going to be storing electrons in batteries, and, you know, Musk and Tesla battery, that's great. We're going to be deploying these things out there. We're going to need them. But what you don't want to do is use that stored electrons to run a compressor in order to cool a building, because there's much lower cost, much more cost-effective ways to do it. And finally, I have a picture of Manhattan here, but instead of running, north-south, I tipped it over. Dense urban environments, if you're trying to collect renewables, it's very difficult to do it in dense urban environments. There's shading on PV, and wind doesn't work well because it's way too swirly. But I think that dense urban environments is where you're going to be storing the energy, because remember, to get to a low-carbon future, we need to collect the energy, and we need to be able to store it, and store it distributed at the site where it's going to be used, or on the edge of the grid is the most effective place. And with that, I'll turn it back to Alexei. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Very interesting. Once again, there are some good questions that have come in, and we will hold them until the very end. So allow me to introduce Jan Berman. Let's go to the next slide. There we go. Jan Berman is the Senior Director of Customer Energy Solutions and Policy and Integrated Planning at Pacific Gas and Electric Company. Jan's team is responsible for providing integrated support and strategic guidance across the complete range of PG&E's demand-side management programs, including customer energy efficiency, demand response, distributed generation and storage, electric vehicles, smart metering, rates and tariffs, home area networking, and new programs. Somewhere in all that, she found the time to join us. Prior to her current position, Jan held numerous regulatory, financial, and operational positions at PG&E, including Director of Rates and Tariffs, Director of Revenue Requirements, Director of Business Development, and Director of Gas Systems Operations. She's earned a bachelor's degree in mathematics from Whitman College, a Master of Operations Research from Stanford University, and an MBA from the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. Jan, it's a pleasure to have you join us.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk about zero net energy from a perspective of what it looks like to a utility that has a long commitment to energy efficiency, commitment to zero net, and also operates the distribution and transmission grid. Let's go on to the next slide. I wanted to start, next slide please. I wanted to start by focusing on something real world. And I can't see if the slides are advancing.
It looks like we're having a little bit of lag. I see just a background coming through.
Jan, which slide do you want? The solar and EV or?
No, there should be one that's on community scale zero net energy.
Okay.
Oh, there we are.
There we are.
Sorry about that.
Thank you. So I wanted to start with some real-world experience with zero net energy. This is a beautiful picture of a zero net energy on a community scale at UC Davis called the West Village. And this actually was constructed in 2008. And it includes a lot of different types of units, including multi-unit student housing, mixed-unit buildings, and a recreation center, 4 megawatts of solar, and also designed for 50% reduction in energy consumption on the load side prior to the addition of solar. As of September of 2015, it was operating at about 82% zero net energy. So I just thought I would start there because zero net energy is something that's real and on the grid, and something that we're experiencing as the distribution grid operator in this area. Next slide, please. I wanted to also take a look at two key trends in California, and that's the growth of solar and the growth of electric vehicles. And you can see that solar has been growing extremely fast the last few years and is anticipated to continue to ramp up. I think we have over 200,000 solar retail customers at this point that have solar on the customer side. And of course, solar is very interesting because it produces two-way flows on a distribution grid originally designed for only one-way flow. So a very exciting trend for the grid operator. A second exciting trend in California is the emergence and growth of electric vehicles. And depending on how they're charged and the timing, they can be a significant instantaneous demand. In some of our milder climates here where there's less air conditioning, an electric vehicle can be equivalent to an extra house or two hopping onto the distribution grid at one time. And as you can imagine, electric vehicles tend to cluster in certain types of neighborhoods, so that is also a real change in the way the grid is operating and will be operating in the future. Now, these are some very exciting trends which could make the distribution grid even more important in the future. So as a utility grid operator, we're quite excited about that prospect. Well, let's take a look at the next slide. Or on the other hand, could we see home loads evolving and zero net energy being an off-the-grid solution? Well, this is intended to be a bit of humor. Well, I think that there will be some buildings that will see value in completely off-grid solutions, especially those that are in more remote locations where there might not yet be a grid. I also think that if the facilities are in an area where there's an existing distribution grid, they're likely to be connected to the grid as a source of power and effectively as a source of battery. As you can see in the quote I included, it's projected that it would be more expensive to use off-grid, complete off-grid type solutions rather than grid connectivity to reach zero net energy. So as a grid operator, we're planning to serve a lot more zero net energy buildings in the future. Next slide. So what does a zero net energy building look like to the grid operator? Let's take a tale of two buildings here. These are two hypothetical buildings, but I thought it looked nicer with pictures. The one on the left is designed around using solar renewables to become zero net energy. And at the moment, the one on the right is designed the same. So the load of each building is shown in yellow there. That's sort of what the natural load of the building would be. And you could simply put solar PV on those buildings in order to achieve zero net. Next slide. Now what we've done is taken the second building and engineered in energy efficiency and demand response and included a solar PV system as well. And as you can see, when we put the energy efficiency in, it significantly reduced the load of the building, and then the demand response option shifted it into the same timing as the solar panel. So quite a different profile. Let's look at the next slide and see how it looks to a grid operator. Well, here we are. As you can see, there's quite a difference in the way the distribution grid views building 1 and building 2 at this point. Next slide. In fact, building 1 has a grid swing of about 25 megawatts, whereas building 2 has a grid swing less than half of that. Looks like it's about 10 megawatts. So a significant difference in the amount of power being pulled from and put to the grid over the course of a 24-hour period. Now, let's imagine from the grid operator perspective that we aggregate that, because we know many more buildings are going to be transitioning, either built to be zero net in the first place or transitioning to be zero net over time in California. Next slide. So this is the duck curve, which kind of aggregates the situation I've been talking about at metascale to ask ourselves, what's the situation like in aggregate as we see more solar both at utility scale and retail scale entering the grid. And what the curve is showing is the amount of dispatchable resource that CAISO would need to dispatch in successive years in the future as there becomes more solar power on the grid. So it's basically the difference between forecasted load and expected supply from variable generation resources. Well, as we can see, as more solar comes on the system, that ramp in the late afternoon when the solar starts to ramp down, there's a significant ramp in the dispatchable generation resources. Let's go to the next slide. Again, trying to take it from a humorous point of view. One of the things we think about as a grid operator is if many zero net energy buildings and communities are built with efficient design, it makes that duck curve a bit flatter, or makes the duck less fat, if you want to say, and that means less storage and less dispatchable accessible resources for the late afternoon ramp. Let's take a look at the next slide. In other words, we'd like to teach that duck to fly by reminding it to focus on energy efficiency and demand response, as well as the renewable components of zero net energy. Next slide. So my key takeaway for this morning is that efficient building design is important to the grid, something that I'll be happy to answer questions on. Next slide. Thanks. Turning it back to Alexi.
Thank you, Jan. While we are here on this question slide, why don't we go ahead and open it up to, well, open it up is not exactly, we're not going to open it up to we're going to leave people muted, but I'll raise some questions that have come up. Jan, did you have one more slide as a bonus? I seem to recall there was, but perhaps there wasn't.
Just some appendix slides, which we can go ahead and take questions and then
okay.
Back to those if we want to look at any of them.
That sounds good. So I'll cover questions not exactly in the order they came in, but relatively close. So there are a couple of questions for Gabriel here about gas in renewable buildings. There was one question at the very beginning during my presentation asking about zero net energy definitions and whether we were referring to site energy or source energy. I think Gabriel did a good job discussing the definition of zero net energy in California, the TDV, or time-dependent valuation. Department of Energy has issued a definition in which they refer to source energy, the upstream amount of energy used at the power plant or other facility to deliver the kilowatt hours to the end user. So the answer is that there are several different definitions. Department of Energy likes source. California uses time-dependent valuation. Some users use site level only. In this case, one of the main important takeaways of this whole presentation is that we have to consider both the building level and the utility level. So if other presenters would like to touch on that, you're welcome to, but I can also go on to the next one. Question for Gabe, specifically, talking about the role of natural gas in zero net energy buildings. You mentioned that there's a possibility going forward of using biogas in current distribution infrastructure and storage infrastructure. How do the greenhouse gas emissions factors vary at all, if at all, between biogas and fossil gas?
So biogas is actually carbon neutral, or depending on how you look at it, could actually be carbon negative in that it's actually capturing methane that would be emitted by facilities such as wastewater treatment plants, dairies, agricultural waste that's left out in the open. So if those methane emissions from those types of methane sources were instead captured and efficiently and effectively sort of processed and used, it would be avoiding methane emissions that would otherwise be just released into the atmosphere.
So let's say we're talking about energy issues at a building level, at the site level. One question was how much gas can a building produce from sewage, compost, and other sources to achieve ZNE on a building basis if it's using natural gas for thermal loads? Have you looked into that at all on the building basis specifically?
Yeah, so there's actually there's a number of technologies that do work at a sort of small scale or localized building scale. In the developing world, there's actually something in India called Gobar, which is basically it's methane capture from wastewater and organic materials, and that's actually used to capture the methane and pipe it in and use it for cooking gas. There's actually I can't remember the name of the company, but there's an Israeli technology firm that has, I think they have demonstration units. They look like the size of about the size of a washing machine, that are intended for basically you toss your compost in there, and it can be food waste, anything organic really. I don't think it's meant for human waste, but you can put other animal waste, whatnot. And at the household level, they provide enough gas for daily cooking needs. So it's not quite at the scale of hot water heating and space heating, but it's a start toward that direction. And I think at the building level, if it's a larger building, especially if it's dealing with in the food industry, if there's a kitchen or a commercial kitchen, or even a some kind of a industrial or food products manufacturing firm, there's often a lot of organic waste, and that can be effectively captured in using a technology like that, and either fed back into the grid or used on site directly for heating and or energy generation needs.
Sure. Very much related, you mentioned micro combined heat and power units, CHP. Are you seeing any small CHP units on a residential scale?
So in the United States, there's nothing, well, I shouldn't say there's nothing. The technology does exist. It's not commercially widespread in the U.S. because of the current cost, upfront cost for those fuel cell CHP units. For fuel cells in particular, they're quite expensive. The actual technology is very, it's a very complicated technology. They do have them commercially available in Europe in certain applications. I know there's a manufacturer in Japan that is providing CHP, micro CHP I think on the scale of like 2 kilowatt capacity, and they're combined with a air handling system, so they're actually providing electricity and heat generation for space heating needs. And then they're also more common in Japan, where there's actually sort of on a household level quite a bit of hot water usage is just sort of a thing in Japan. So there's a relative demand, and electricity is relatively expensive. So there's a bit more of a financial case for doing fuel cell technology over there. Okay. That's the short answer.
Sure.
We are, I would say within the next 2 years, there probably will be some commercially available 1 and 2 kilowatt systems. We're, as a company, our research and development group is looking at a number of different options and kind of, looking at ways that we can do some testing and development in that area.
I'll be interested to see what comes out. Moving from the building scale to the grid scale, still talking about gas and zero-net energy buildings, one person asks if you see a phase-out of natural gas at any time in the future with increases in electricity storage and generation efficiency, especially considering what the questioner refers to as the diminishing infrastructure of our current natural gas facilities, storage centers, and transportational elements, most recently noting the current methane leak in Aliso Canyon just northwest of Los Angeles, which is a very large methane leak in an underground natural gas storage field.
Sure.
Where do you see... Go ahead.
I was going to say there's a few different parts to that question. So regarding the Aliso Canyon situation, that is obviously a very important and difficult situation that our company is working on. I'm not directly related, so I can't speak to any of the details on that. But in the big picture, we see natural gas as being a major part of our underlying infrastructure, our energy infrastructure in California, and we believe that it will have an important role to play going on into the future. Obviously, there's an increase in renewable generation on the electricity side from solar and wind. We recognize that, and we support that. But at the same time, the industrial base and the commercial and residential base across California is heavily invested in natural gas, and it is sort of a customer choice issue. It's also a efficiency issue, and I think I talked about some of that in my presentation. The actual end use of gas is far more efficient for things like space heating and cooking and water heating at this point.
Sure.
But we do see the need to transition towards renewable sources of natural gas, as it were, or renewable gas from things like biogas and power to gas. So there, it is a long-term transition, but in the near term, over the next 20, 30 years, it's a major player.
One question centered on the fact that the Living Building Challenge does not allow on-site combustion. Currently, that's another certification for zero net energy buildings. It's actually beyond just zero net energy to several other green building aspects. The question notes that it seems gas will play an important role for a long time as we progress toward net zero. But the person's wondering about whether the ultimate goal eliminates gas usage, considering, say, a thought experiment in which we have perfect renewable generation and storage systems. And I would say that while I'm not involved in setting the standards for the Living Building Challenge, of course, not my organization, that there could be a role for renewable-based natural gas as an energy storage technology, as you mentioned during your presentation, for power to gas during peak times, and also for biogas,
right,
in order to keep that infrastructure from just rusting in the ground and allow us to take advantage of the inherent efficiencies there.
I would agree, and I think the alternative, eliminating gas entirely. I think the Living Building Challenge, I don't know all the details of that, but obviously it's promoting these sort of cutting-edge technologies in efficiency and on-site generation that are extremely valuable and laudable. But in terms of doing that at scale for all buildings, there is, as I noted, a cost element involved. Electricity from the grid is quite a bit more expensive than equivalent unit of gas for the same purpose, for heating, for example. So it ends up costing a fair amount more if we eliminate gas entirely. Now, as we transition to renewable sources on rooftops, and it's 100% renewable, availability, and we solve the storage question of energy storage, then some of those price kind of pain points will start to diminish. But it's
sure.
We see it as a long-term solution and sort of a series of different transitions, but gas can provide a very cost-effective baseline energy source.
Just very briefly, do you have an idea of the overall conversion efficiency for power to gas technologies?
I don't. I believe that it's relatively low. There's a number of steps involved, and that's a great question. It's something. It is an expensive technology, and it's done at a utility scale. They're doing it in Germany right now because they have massive peaks of wind power from their offshore wind farms, from what I understand. So they're actively investing lots and lots of money in government subsidies in developing utility scale version of that. But I believe the cost, and the actual efficiency, the conversion efficiency is not, it's not 100%. Certainly, it's
sure. And these are emerging technologies as well.
Yes.
Question for Mark McCracken and others as potentially interested. Regarding your demand peak situation, the question is, among other behavioral or demand reductions, why couldn't utility scale battery storage of 2 to 4% simply reduce or replace the 21% infrastructure cost? So the question centers around the costs and benefits between battery and thermal storage, basically.
Right. So batteries are going to be needed. The battery technology right now is on a first cost basis probably 10 times that of thermal, maybe less than that. And I think over the next 5 to 10 years, the battery price will come down. But the other thing that you have to think about is the life of the battery. Most of us know how batteries do change over time with our laptops and things. And most of the thermal storage technologies are going to last 30, 40, 50 years, this sort of thing. So it's more the time scale of a power plant as opposed to something that you're going to have to replace 3 or 4 times in a 40, 50 year period. So cost is a big issue associated with it, but batteries are going to be needed. You can't store light. You can't store kind of moving air. So you're going to need to store electrons in the form of batteries or water high up that you can turn back into electrons. But the lower hanging fruit is thermal, because most of those electrons in that 2% of the hours of the year, most of that is that instantaneous creation of cooling. And so it's might as well make that when you have lots of power. And some of that energy might be coming during the day from your solar collectors in your duct curve. You may be creating and storing your energy then for later needs of cooling.
In a related question, how can you move the design community to include some percentage of stored cooling to meet the peak design day load rather than as redundant capacity? This questioner notes that they see CalMac projects with chillers of 100 to 120% peak design day capacity, which means that the storage is being used sort of as a redundant piece of the equation rather than including the storage capacity in the calculation so that they can reduce the chiller size from the outset.
Yeah, so there are 2 extreme ways to do our type of thermal storage. One is full storage, where you make enough, I have big enough chillers that at night you make enough storage that the next day you don't have to run any equipment, and you're just using the cool storage to meet your entire load. That's called full storage. Partial storage can go to the totally opposite extreme. You would put in maybe a half-size chiller, and at night it would store energy, much less storage you would need. And then during the day you would run a chiller, and the chiller in combination with the stored cooling meets the load. And depending upon where you are and what the electric rates structures are, you will choose in between those extremes. On most projects, we do the latter. We do a downsizing of the chiller equipment, and you're kind of sizing for the average load. But in some places, typically California is one, they have a super peak period where they used to have from noon to 6, it's extremely expensive for your electricity. And so the design in that particular case is for those hours you would go full storage, and for the hours outside of that extreme peak problem area, you would run chiller and some storage. And when you do a design like that, very often the chiller getting installed is about the same capacity, or maybe a little less, as the questioner stated, or a little more. It may be a little bit more, but it's all depending on how you're trying to size it.
Sure. Question for Jan about shaving peak loads. So here's an interesting one for you, Jan. If shaving peak loads is really important to the utility operators, why don't they increase demand charges and make that clear to the customers?
Well, one thing that's interesting is the timing of what you might think of as the peak load is shifting as more solar comes online. So we used to think of peak as the midday, and now it is increasingly shifting toward the late afternoon when the solar systems ramp down. But it could be that pricing strategies will be an effective part of managing the peak. And certainly if grid connectivity is an important piece of the future, then it could be appropriate to have charges for that as well.
Is that
I would also I'd like to put in on that a little bit also.
Sure.
I think the questioner is right on the money, because if you think about net metering and zero energy buildings, you know, in net over the year, by definition, they're not using any kWh, and yet the grid has delivered a tremendous service. Now that zero energy building is drawing a peak demand at some time when that cloud comes over. It's drawing from the grid. The lights come on because it's shadier, and it turns out that some research shows that your peak demand in a zero energy building is not much less than it normally would be, whether it was on grid or off grid. So the point is that the utility is having to give you that, and it is, I looked at rates in California and New York, two different utilities in California, and indeed the demand charges are growing and are growing at a strong rate. And it's my opinion that demand charges will be going up because there's going to be less kWh being sold, and yet the utilities are going to have essentially the same infrastructure backing up in case the renewables aren't there.
All right, we've got about 4 minutes left, and I am happy that there's so much interest in asking questions. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of them. I'll ask one or two more, and then we'll wrap this up. Jan, a question for you about what PG&E is doing to develop both utility-scale battery storage and to develop or encourage thermal or other types of storage.
That's a little out of my area of expertise.
Okay. We will move on to a different one then. What's your view of smart grid growth and your comments on the impact of real-time pricing or time of use valuation?
I'm thinking about the context of smart grid growth. I guess I will connect that to the idea that increasingly there are two-way flows on the distribution grid, and more variability in load we may have seen in the past. So utilizing the smart grid and smart meter infrastructure that's been installed, there's a value proposition there for managing the demand side, perhaps more aggressively using either dispatch signals or automated technology like the smart thermostats or other types of controls like air conditioner controls to shift the timing of loads in a way that still provides the consumer the service that they need but creates less grid fluctuations. And that clearly rate design and pricing can be a component of that, and controls can be a component of that.
Sure.
I think one important thing that's going to need to be done is that there's going to have to be more awareness that there is a difference in price in the past and now, and will be even more in the future. But I would venture to guess that because people don't have it available, there's not much time of day usage or difference residentially. Unless once it gets to a residential scale, there aren't demand charges residentially. Until it gets to a residential scale and people start internalizing that there is a big difference and there are signals there, it's going to take some time.
Absolutely. Well, it's 11:29 here where I am, and very close to the end of our webinar time here. So I want to say thank you for joining us. These slides will be available tomorrow on our website and can be viewed on demand, and they'll be distributed to participants by email. We'll endeavor to get your questions answered by email if we were not able to cover them during this last discussion period here. And as you exit the webinar, a survey will open. we encourage you to fill that out. It helps us, those answers help us make the best webinars possible, make sure that we're able to cover topics that are important to you, and let us make this all work better. And you can also enter your AIA member number for credits at that time. With that, I want to say thank you to our participants, thank you to everyone on the call, and I hope that you have enjoyed the last hour and a half.